This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, let's talk about the first days of a new administration, how new presidents have spent their time in the wake of their inauguration. Obviously, we see that this time around, Donald Trump is taking on an everything, everywhere, all at once type approach, issuing executive orders around basically all of his main campaign promises and priorities. We will see how many of those stand up to any legal opposition or what legal opposition will look like in the coming days and weeks and months. But throughout history, other presidents have taken maybe a more measured approach and they have reflected their different priorities. So here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
A little housekeeping, actually, before we get going, listeners. I just want to say that we've been talking internally on the show a fair amount about how to best do the marriage of history and political analysis that we were kind of doing a fair amount last year during the election. And I think we have gotten great feedback on the moments when we've kind of really explicitly talked about what's going on in the world today and tried to put it in historical context. And so our plan is to do more episodes a little bit like the one we're doing today, where we're going to live in this moment, the first moments of the Trump presidency, and then also put it in historical context. But, you know, we are going to try and cover this next stretch, which feels very historical in many ways in the way that we do. So that's just to frame today and to frame kind of our ongoing project. And listeners, I will say, you know, thanks for all the feedback on these kinds of episodes. And the best thing you can do to kind of support us as we kind of do more of these episodes is to Venmo me $100,000. Okay? The best,
put me down for $100,000.
The best thing you can do to support the show is keep giving us feedback and actually subscribe to the newsletter, subscribe to the YouTube page. I think those are going to be the two kind of centers for a lot of this, in addition to the actual podcast, and spread the word. But yeah, we are going to really try and do more of what it means to live in this historical second Trump presidency. So any thoughts there right off the bat? We're about 48 hours into Trump's second term. We saw this flurry of executive orders. What's on your mind?
The executive orders were intense. There were a lot of them. I think the flood the zone with shit method that defined the first presidency certainly defined these first 24 hours, because it's hard to know kind of where to focus. You had the pardon of the January 6th participants, which I think is a defining act of the first day of his presidency. It defines his relationship to political violence, to insurrection. It sort of embeds it at the heart of his movement. So that's something that I am paying particularly close attention to. But I mean, he stripped away federal protections from trans Americans. He is undoing diversity, equity, and inclusion programs throughout the government and possibly cutting federal funding for any number of institutions that take care of trans Americans or even recognize that they exist, which I think is going to be a big problem. And then the question is how much of it has any force. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit.
Yeah. I mean, you know how Maya Angelou has that quote, like, when people tell you who they are, believe them. And I have felt that very deeply with Trump, this idea that when he says he's going to do something, 9 times out of 10, you know, if it's within his realm of possibility, it's going to happen. And so not to echo too much of what Nikki said, but yeah, the pardoning of the January 6th, I mean, like, political violence is something that I write about a lot. And getting pardons for people that wreaked havoc, unprecedented havoc on a federal building where lives were literally lost and at stake. It just does not, like, I can't make sense of that in my mind, especially when, you know, that very morning, like, Biden is pardoning people as well. And actually had weeks up until the inauguration had been pardoning people who had been on death row, who had, like, been falsely committed of a crime. pardons that were really needed and necessary, or commutations to their sentences. And this just felt so egregious, especially for the police officers who were there, who were traumatized by January 6th. I still recall some of their testimony. And then, yeah, you know, as an academic, I know Nikki and I are thinking about this all the time, and like the rolling back of DEI, like it's hard to really prepare for something that is not just a gimmick, you know, like the way that we teach history is not some sort of cliche kind of perspective. Like, these things happened. And if we don't grapple with what it means to talk about immigration and the history of it, or to talk about civil rights and the history of that, I'm really, really concerned. I fear that people will lose their jobs, and that people will lose their credibility. And I don't know how to square that. But I will say this. Yesterday, I spent all day like giving MLK lectures all day. And I felt like this is the best thing I could be doing right now. And everyone in that audience was like, oh my, we needed this word. It was like being in church. Like it was very, very good to sort of be with other people who just wanted to talk about, okay, so what's the plan?
Yeah.
And how do we go forward? So that was good.
Nikki, do you want to jump back in on something?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that first of all, I do think it's good to counter program and to remember that some of these fights have been going on for a very long time, and that we're in this for the long haul. But the other one that I was thinking about, you know, I mentioned kind of the limits of power, the potential limits of power. I mean, the other major executive order was Trump claiming the authority to reinterpret the 14th Amendment's birthright citizenship clause. And, you know, it is true that is written into the Constitution. It would be unconstitutional to read it the way that he suggests, nor does he necessarily have the interpretive power to claim a reading of the Constitution like this, right? We've handed that power over to the Supreme Court. At the same time, it is meaningful that he has put that stake in the ground and made that claim. And that is a signal to both Congress and to the Supreme Court about how he would like to read that provision. And I think it has already sent fear through communities across the United States that if they make a claim of citizenship, that claim will now be contested instead of just straight up recognized. And I think that's a real worry.
I keep sort of shuffling the list in my head of which of these sort of scares me the most, or which will be the sort of have the biggest impact.
I know.
You know, and so I'll just add to the list. I mean, pulling out of WHO is just like such a clear own goal that just will hurt us in such like concrete ways, and you know, hurt the Trump administration if they are overseeing the next pandemic, which I think just got a lot more likely. So, you know, that's certainly on my list. And look, I think I'm making the list of kind of like all of these issues and the historical lenses through which we can understand them. And I want to do something on birthright citizenship, and I want to do something on WHO, and I want to do something on sedition and pardoning and political violence, obviously. My one thought, and then we'll get on to kind of trying to really understand the first days in office in historical context. But, you know, one of my thoughts is like that what went down on Inauguration Day was actually Trump's, from his perspective, that was the peak. That is exactly what he wanted, right? He wanted to sit in front of thousands and thousands of people and sign all those executive orders and throw pens into the audience and have a rally. And, you know, there is a ton of on the ground fallout from that photo op, basically. But, you know, the photo op is the thing that Trump, I remain convinced, is the thing that Trump is most interested in.
The numbers, the crowd size.
Yeah, and so there's part of me that's like wondering and thinking about kind of Inauguration Day as a little bit of a peak, and certainly a peak from like a cultural sense. You know, I mean, I wonder if we'll look back and be like, the period between the election and Inauguration Day was the most ascendant that the sort of MAGA from a cultural perspective was, right? All the attention, all the photo ops and so forth. And, you know, who knows? But I do feel like people are going to react to all these January 6th people getting, if the information environment can sustain it, I think people are going to react to all these January 6th people now going free. I think Elon Musk doing a Nazi salute was probably not a good move, even in 2025, and so there's part of me that's just like, they kind of got a little too, flew a little too close to the sun, or that was it from a cultural sense, and we'll see. But again, as we've been saying, it really comes down to a lot of what goes on the ground and a lot of the legal back and forth. Do these proclamations hold up? A lot of these documents, by the way, were seemingly written with AI. Like, they're pretty shoddy. A lot of lawyers are like,
they're extremely shoddy.
We'll see.
Yeah, I was reading through them.
But
can I just say that, like, I was doing so good because, I was giving all these lectures and stuff, so I was busy.
Yeah.
And then it was like, I don't know, like 9:39. I was like, gosh, I haven't really eaten anything. So my husband and I go into this pizza shop just to grab like a slice. And on the TV, Fox News is playing and they're showing like the inauguration and the ball. No, they're showing the balls and all this stuff. And I was like, I was doing so good.
Yeah.
I had avoided all of it.
Yeah. I mean, I went to a movie yesterday
like,
at 1:30 p.m.
appetite.
Yeah, for sure. But look, my head, as I just said, is a little on the kind of like imagery and symbolism and the sort of like media environment around all this, which I think is a good way to transition into some history, because I do think a lot of presidents, especially early presidents, really did treat Inauguration Day as a, for lack of a better term, symbolic act. And so we've kind of split up inaugurations into a few different kind of vibes that new presidents take on. So one is like a little symbolic, one is policy oriented, and another is kind of like immediately confrontational and in a fight with the opposition. So we're going to go through each of those categories quickly. It makes sense that some of the earliest presidents were the ones who really thought of Inauguration Day mostly as symbolic. And so like George Washington was very, very concerned with the sort of way that he took the oath, the pageantry of it all. But, then it's a quieter time. Like the night after he gets inaugurated, he just goes and he has a quiet dinner. Not many people know about it. It's at the Walter Franklin House in downtown NYC. It got demolished in 1856. But, Washington has a pretty chill, quiet inauguration day.
Honestly, love it. Love it for him. He's a fancy boy, so he had a very regal inauguration day. And then, a little quiet supper to end everything. It's kind of
dinner
sweet.
and a warm bath.
Well, it's like, I mean, it
My
is
plans for the evening.
It is the media environment where they're like, right now, like a modern president has to be like, we have to capture the, hour-long attention span media environment. And Washington's advisors are sitting there going, we only have a 3-week news cycle that we have to take advantage of. So they've got a little bit more time.
Like most Americans won't have even read the inaugural address 3 weeks from now.
Right.
So it's fine.
Have you ever had the urge to sneak behind the cordoned off areas of a museum? Or roam the halls after closing time? The Smithsonian's flagship podcast, Side Door, will sneak you behind the scenes of the world's largest museum and research complex. Come learn about the ghosts that supposedly walk the museum halls after dark, how a train robbery gave rise to criminal forensics, why leeches are actually the coolest thing ever, and how to get away with murder in the Arctic. Maybe. You'll discover stories of history, science, art, and culture you won't find in a display case. You can listen to Side Door wherever you get your podcasts, or find us online at si.edu/sidedoor.
Andrew Jackson, 1829, gets inaugurated in March. The inaugurations used to be in March, so March 4th. And there's a massive crowd with him as he's walking down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House and getting the oath at the Capitol. And this was a period when the tradition was sort of that the doors of the White House or would get flung open and the people could come in. And it was a real sort of people's house kind of idea. And in this moment, the first floor of the White House kind of filled to capacity and people began climbing over chairs and furniture to try and get a glimpse of the new president. And then drinks show up and ice cream shows up, but it had a real kind of like, I don't know, what's the garden party kind of vibe, I suppose.
Festival.
Well, I was about to say more like a rave, I think. I think it was pretty packed in there. Things start getting broken pretty quickly. The drinking might have preceded the arrival to the White House.
It's not a good idea.
And then Biden did this on Monday, but in 1977 is when we get that tradition of the outgoing president departing via helicopter. And even now, like, that seems to be a very solemn thing where he gets sent off. And I heard all these reports about, like, this was Biden's last opportunity to ride on Marine One, and then he gets to go and then he goes on vacation. But that started in 77. And Ford decided to do a little sightseeing on his way out, so he asked the helicopter pilot to fly around and look at the landmarks in D.C. one last time.
Fine.
Circle around. I want to see the monument.
Yeah. Especially in 1977, that he might have been like, that might be my last helicopter ride. You never know.
Yeah,
I'm not mad at that. I support
yeah,
it.
that's fine.
And then the other kind of like big thing that happens that's very symbolic, but I think shows some kind of priorities, is like, who do you call first? And I feel like we've all seen those images of, like, on Inauguration Day, the new president makes a first phone call. Biden called Justin Trudeau. Obama, on his first full day in office, January 21st, 2009, he called 4 Middle Eastern leaders, Hosni Mubarak, Ehud Olmert, Jordan's King Abdullah, and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, clearly signaling something there. And we're not sure who Trump called. It may have been Shinzo Abe, who Trump called in his first year, but that was a very busy day. A, we're not entirely sure who he called, and B, the phone records for the Trump White House were not as buttoned up as previous administrations.
Might have used his burner for that
he
first
might have
call.
used his burner for that first call. Yeah. You can all take a guess of who that first call might have been to. All right. And then usually, it's just like, get to work, right? And I think a lot of that is get to work on the big policy priorities. So, Nikki, you want to take it away on kind of which
Sure.
presidents have felt most policy-oriented in those first couple of days?
I was going to say get to work. I mean, JFK rumoredly got to one of the jobs that he did regularly as president, which was sleeping with as many women as possible. There's a rumor that he slept with like 2 or 3 women on Inauguration Day, which might be a record.
I think that counts as
work.
Yeah, seriously. That counts as a policy priority for JFK. So.
I think so. I mean, look, of all of his accomplishments, yes, but policy, especially as the presidency became a more policy-oriented position in the 20th century, there was a real drive to try to define what the policy agenda for the presidency was going to be. And the inaugural address was one way of doing that. But then you start to get within the first week, sometimes even the first day of a presidency, actions taken by the president to sort of set the policy goals for the presidency. And Franklin Roosevelt really is the first to tackle this in a very aggressive and very well communicated way, right? In Roosevelt's case, he talked about the first 100 days, but he's also working in what at that point, thanks to radio, was a sped up news cycle, right? So he's got to get things done more quickly. He can communicate it much more quickly, and he's coming in the middle of an emergency. Mm-hmm. So he's coming in the middle of the Great Depression. One of the first things he does is he closes down the banks. He calls for a bank holiday in order to stabilize the financial system. And what
can
that
we
does
linger
is,
on that? I mean, that's wild. He gets inaugurated on March 4th, and on March 6th, he's like, the banks are shutting down for a day.
Yeah, and then he waits for Congress to do a little bit of enacting legislation a few days later. And this is going to become a theme because, presidents want to increasingly after Roosevelt hit the ground running and get all of these things done on the first day. But they don't actually have legislative power. That's Congress. So that's why you start to get the rise, particularly in more recent years, of executive orders that are issued in those first days and first weeks in order to signal, okay, these are the policy priorities I'm going to assume. So Bill Clinton comes into office. He signs, actually, his first executive order is an ethics pledge, which should we call it ironic? I mean, it certainly comes out of the ethos of an election where Ross Perot, running as the reform candidate, is in Clinton's brain. But it's also the moment when he starts to talk about making good on his promise to allow gay men and women to serve openly in the military. Yeah. Obama comes into office. Same thing, issues a bunch of executive orders, including one that calls for the closing of Guantanamo Bay, another one of his big campaign promises. you might recognize a similarity between those two things, which is neither one of those actually gets fulfilled because they require enacting legislation and they can't get it.
Yeah.
So what is, and we can put Trump in this context too, but what is your sense then of the executive order and the rise of the executive order? Is it purely symbolic, like it's an easy opportunity to say, here is me fulfilling or following up on a campaign pledge? Or is it a sort of way to circumvent the legal process a little bit to say we're going to, move the Overton window way out here and then let the courts sort of try and clean up? And I think there's actually a third thing with Trump, which I'll sort of say in a second. But I'm just kind of curious what the mix is in your estimation.
I think it's a both and, which is to say, sure, if they'll let us get away with this. And I mean, in the case of the Guantanamo Bay closings, Obama, I think, believed he could get it through that way. Congress comes in and enacts legislation that strips that power away. And so, I mean, it's more complicated than that. But anyway, but there's a fight that it sets up. I do think it's a way of trying to advance the ball, right? It's just saying this is a priority. Let's get going. So it's not a purely symbolic victory because there is real policy behind it, or a symbolic move because there's real policy behind it. But it's often greeted in the press as more of a fait accompli than it actually is.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a big win for an incoming administration.
And it focuses attention, which I think, attention is currency, attention is finite, and so it just says, okay, well, look, maybe there's a fight looming, but the fight is going to be about these 5 things,
Yes.
And
it's a way of saying, like, look, I tried. I told you I was going to do this, and I did, even if you didn't.
Well, so on that point, though, I think that when I think about Trump, and the Trump administration, I mean, I think it plays right into their hands to potentially do a million of these executive orders, have maybe the majority of them get really bogged down and there's a lot of pushback and not go anywhere, and then get to run against the fact that those got bogged down and there was pushback for all these years. It might work in their favor to actually have a lot of opposition because then you just get to run on that for 3.5 years.
Well, you also get to just declare victory, right? Like in a lot of these cases, there are also executive orders about inflation and about immigration. Like inflation and immigration are way down. So all you have to do is say, look, immigration and inflation are way down and look at these executive orders, which I think is also some messaging we will be hearing very soon.
Yes.
Jimmy Carter, as we've done an episode on, pardoned Vietnam draft evaders. So there's even pardoning. Usually that happens at the end of a presidency, but, it happens at the beginning.
On the first day one.
And, we obviously saw Trump do some pardoning this year. I mean, Trump's favorite moves are executive orders and pardons because those are the closest to just sort of, I'm the king, I can make a decision. I'm the CEO, I'm the king, I can make a decision, and here we go, as the presidency has. Jimmy Carter also asked people to set their heat in their homes to 65 degrees to save energy.
Put on a sweatshirt and some socks.
Oh, Jimmy.
It's a nice little combo there. Pardon some draft evaders and try and address the draftiness in people's homes. All right.
Well done.
Let's move on to some of the stuff we've been talking about a little bit too, but there have been a number of presidencies where in those first 48 hours, it's like, oh, the slog is here immediately.
Immediately. I mean, like, you start to see right after the election, like even before the inauguration, you start to see this contestations over who's going to be selected for cabinet positions, who's going to be, nominated. Is their nomination going to go through? Does their nomination have like a conflict of interest? And there are a lot of those with every single presidency. But with Eisenhower in 1953, one of his Secretary of Defense picks was Charlie Wilson, who had been the CEO of GM. And when you step down from these like corporate gigs, you have to divest of your stock.
You used to have to.
This is an old-fashioned rule we're talking about.
Yes, and he had $2.5 million of GM stock, but nothing in 1953. And it's just so funny that, during his hearings, he's like, I thought what was good for the country was good for General Motors and vice versa. Like, isn't this fine. Why do I need to do this? And so some people definitely give pushback when it comes to sort of divesting of their own wealth.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's people that just have like general bad character and are unfit for certain positions. Like John Tower, he was nominated to become the second Secretary of Defense in 1989. And people were like, this guy is not a good fit. Like, he's an alcoholic. He's a womanizer. Like, there's all these conflicts of interest. And sometimes when that gets enough traction in the media, people will just sort of like rescind their nomination. They'll say, actually, I'm not going to take this opportunity, because they don't want the embarrassment of it going to a vote and it being, and they're being disqualified. But
another outdated idea that the Secretary of Defense should not be an alcoholic abuser woman.
Can we talk about it?
It is remarkable that every single president has had at least one nominee withdraw at some point in their tenure. And I don't know, it's something I've been thinking about, is there is a little bit of a performative nature to this. Like, we're going to put some people out there, and some of these are going to be people that everyone's comfortable with. And, even Marco Rubio got a unanimous vote, right? Because it was kind of understood. He's the most normal of Trump's nominees this year. And then but I do wonder how much kind of it is also understood that, some of these people are going to withdraw. And so there is a little bit of like, let me throw some names out there. Some chum, is that the phrase? Some chum,
Some of these people should.
Chum the water.
Yeah, we're going to throw some names out there, understanding that there's a process here by which maybe they will have to back down, and then that has a ripple effect on the others who then get to seem more normal, or there's more room for compromise. I mean, it is this interesting dance that isn't purely just in a vacuum, is this person qualified?
Yeah.
I
throw
think
out the most radical person so that the person you really want can get in, because they seem more appealing than the person who's a fanatic or whatever.
I think that's a much more recent evolution of this, though, because
sure.
I think that once Tower gets taken down and that's seen as a big embarrassment for the Bush administration in its opening days, then it's like, when Clinton gets into office, who can we take out? And it becomes kind of a weaponization of that holding Tower accountable.
Any other notable moments of fighting and kind of getting bogged down in those early days?
I mean, I do think about the 19th century, and I do think about William Henry Harrison, the most famous president there is. People always forget about him. But he's a war hero. He comes to the White House in 1840, and he refuses to obey anything that Senator Henry Clay, who's pretty much running the party, has to say. And he says to him, Mr. Clay, you forget, I'm the president. Like, this idea of, like, you're not going to call the shots. And immediately, there is scrambling over power, even within their own party.
Yeah. I mean, that's got to not feel good when it's your own party that's giving you a hard time.
Yeah.
So let's take a step back now as we wrap up. But I'm curious, kind of, if you see Trump fitting into any of these categories. I mean, he's certainly not the I'm going to lay low, do a bunch of kind of like august and symbolic gestures. He's going for it, but
confrontational.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
certainly.
And so I guess that's still a little TBD, right? How much does that confrontation then get bogged down, right?
Yeah. Even when he has the majority in the House, you would think that even with the majority, he would be able to sort of sweep in any of his picks. But among the party, there's still a handful of people that are not on board with everyone who is being selected. And what you're seeing now, too, is that those handful of people that are not on board are being publicly pressured to do the bidding of the president, to like fall in line. And this is not about sort of like character or morality. This is about toting the party line.
Yeah. It actually seems to fit in all of like symbolism, policy, and confrontation because of the way that Trump's politics work, right? He is very forcefully coming in and saying, these are the things that we are going to do, and I dare you to defy me. Right. And sort of setting up the fights that are going to take up the rest of his presidency, both between Trump and the Democrats, but also within his own party on a number of these issues.
And there were some executive orders in there about not just setting up the the fights, but also the mechanics of the fights, right? I mean, there were attempts to kind of rework the way in which you have acting leaders in the cabinet, you have kind of the confirmation process, like the whole sort of process by which you try and get your way is something that Trump is trying to undermine as well. And I think that will get a lot of legal pushback because I think there are still people sort of minding the process a little bit. We'll see. The one other thing we'll say is, like, it is funny, and we should do an episode of this as we get closer to 100 days or whatever, but it is amazing how, like, that metric from 100 days to 100 hours, and now it feels like 100 minutes, of attention. So what counts as your kind of first act of presidency? I mean, at this point, it might just be a couple days. So, yeah. All right. Well, let's leave it there. This was good to kind of get our heads around these first hours of the second Trump presidency. So again, listeners, we're going to try and do more of these episodes as we go, most likely on Sundays as we go, most likely with a video component as we go. So subscribe to the YouTube page, subscribe to the newsletter, and let us know kind of what current issues could use a little historical perspective as we go. But Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.